My name is Liam Wickham, and I am the founder of game-production.com, where we seek to enable games industry professionals to plan better, lead better, and stop the crunch culture through building a community of support, knowledge, and training. Today, we are fortunate indeed to be chatting with Chris Keeling, executive producer at Street Smarts VR and living in Orlando, Florida. Previously, Chris has had a myriad of impressive roles, including product director at Wargaming, where he was the first American to join the Eastern Europe-centric company at the senior level. He was program manager at Full Sail University, leading the Game Design Bachelor of Science department on behalf of almost 2,000 students. Chris served in the US Army as a Sergeant First Class for 23 years with 10 years of active duty. He has been a game designer and writer and worked on titles such as Panzer Elite, America's Army, World of Tanks, Master of Orion, and World of Warships Blitz for mobile. I met Chris at Wargaming in Cyprus when he was Director of Operations for the new mobile gaming division. Chris's understanding of the game design lifecycle, process optimization, prototype development, and game system design is tempered by his pragmatic approach to getting shit done, presumably something he learned in the Army. Chris is a fast car fanatic, Star Wars geek, and owns a whole lot of board games. He is a terrifying paintball opponent, as is his son. Good day, Mr. Chris Keeling.
Thank you, Liam. Good day. How are you?
I'm good, very good. I'm very happy to be talking to you. As I always say to people, it's great that I can look through your profile and think a little bit about how I know you from the past and what I know about you. But can you tell us a little bit about your potted history and what you're up to?
Well, most recently, since leaving Wargaming a couple of years ago, I was the studio director at Bohemia Interactive Simulations, working on it's PC-based, large-scale multiplayer simulations with potentially hundreds and thousands of simultaneous users. And currently, as you said, I'm the executive producer at Street Smarts VR, where we are making lethal force decision training for law enforcement and military personnel. And we're doing it with in Unity with HTC Vives, and it's working out very well.
Good. The job before that with the thousands of people, what was that? What was the actual project?
That was for the U.S. Army, project under Army Futures Command. Actually ended up being given to another company after our prototypes were developed and compared, which is why I'm no longer there.
Okay, but I think it's fair to say, I mean, like, you've worked on America's Army in the past, Panzer Elite, World of Tanks, etc. I think it's fair to say that the Army and you are interrelated somewhat. So can we talk a little bit about your military experience and how you think that's related to what you're doing at the moment and what you were doing when you were rock solid inside the gaming industry at Wargaming, for example, and so on?
Absolutely. Everybody should have a differentiator if they want to get into the games industry. It's extremely challenging to get in. There's a lot more people who want to get in it, especially young people who are willing to eat nothing but Cheetos and sleep under their desks and take a very minimal wage just to be in the game industry. And so I leveraged my military experience to that end. When I started on Panzer Elite in 1998, wow, that's a long time ago.
It is.
I actually...
They had computers back then, kids.
Barely, right? I actually got the job through a posting that was on a web-based forum about tank history, military history. And someone had posted, hey, we're making this video game and we're looking for someone who can write a manual. Back in the 90s, game manuals had a very big, thick, reference manuals.
Yeah.
And so I applied for it. I talked to the guy who was in charge, who turned out to be the CEO, and I got the gig. And at the time, I was still on active duty in the Army. And so I was acting as a paid consultant. And then not only did I end up writing this 70,000-word historical reference guide, but also the user reference manual, and I ran the beta testing for North America, which was, of course, one of the prime markets. And I said, wow, when my term of service is up in another couple of years, I'm going to make games. Forget this Army stuff. So I kind of did that, actually, in 2000. When I got out of the Army, I went to the Army Reserve, which I served for another 13 years. But I went straight to technology from there.
Was that when America's Army was around?
America's Army didn't start until 2002. So at that point, I actually worked in financial software for a while and then consulted. But America's Army was an excellent project. We actually had 2 projects simultaneously that we were developing. One is the very well-known first-person shooter, America's Army Operations. And the other one was the lesser known, because it was canceled, America's Army Soldiers, which was a role-playing game. And I was hired to be the lead designer on that project. And eventually the America's Army Operations launched sooner. And because it was becoming very successful, the decision was made to scrap the role-playing project and focus instead on the very quickly growing success of the America's Army shooter.
Okay, so let me interrupt. So far, what I know about you, if I'm coming in blind here, is that you're in the Army, and then suddenly you find yourself making games as a designer. How do you feel that you were benefited? You said about a differentiator, and in your profile, you talk about how you became highly efficient with project management, mentoring, team building, leadership skills, that you learned that sort of stuff with your distinguished military service. What was it about military service that enabled you to bring something special into video games?
I think it was a combination of the fact that I was mainly working on military games. Therefore, I had the understanding of the genre and the authenticity, the historical background, and things like that. But also, those are the kinds of games I played, partly because I do have a military background. I played strategy games, I played shooters, that I understood those games pretty well, and I understood what they were trying to represent pretty well. I did, of course, and as everyone learns in the military, you learn self-discipline, you learn to work hard, work long hours, get the job done, mission first.
What about team building and leadership? I mean, I'm really personally interested in those, the way that producers are expected to develop those skills, mentoring as well. You're supposed to be a good mentor, great at team building, keeping a team together, great at leadership, just because you happen to be a producer who's climbing up through the ranks. Do you think, what can you say to people who haven't been in the military that you gained because of your experience?
The U.S. Army provides, obviously, a lot of leadership examples on a day-to-day basis, even in peacetime. But they also provide training for that. There's different levels of training in the U.S. Army that they're called part of the non-commissioned officer education system. And there's the first one is a month long. And actually, they're all of them fairly long. And every time you go up past the first one, to go up in rank, you have to attend one of these leadership schools. So you do get quite a bit of schooling in this area, but also on a day-to-day basis, you're constantly reminded of, some of it seemed a bit formal, right? Of course, it's military, so you have to do everything in a certain amount of time. You have to have a counseling every 90 days with each of your subordinates, so like a one-on-one in which you explain what they did right and what they did wrong and where you see them going. And annually, you also have to do a full annual review. And there's a lot of formal paperwork for all these things, but it does give you, even if you don't know much about it to begin with, it gives you a lot of support and guidance in what you are supposed to be doing to be a good leader, how to be effective as part of a team, and how to be responsible to those who are above you.
Okay, and do you think that in production there should be some form of formal training offered or provided by companies that isn't there at the moment?
Yes, there is a lot of training in some areas that's mostly based on validating your experience. For example, like the PMI certification, right, from the Project Management Institute. It has a great foundation. You have to have at least 10,000 hours as a project manager. You have to have a certain amount of skill already. They're not really offering training. They have a lot of reference information, a lot of very valuable things like the PMBOK, the Project Manager's Book of Knowledge. But those are still reference materials where you're not handheld in any of these things. You're just expected to know them all. It's really only good for evaluating people who are already experienced project managers. If you want the training, you have to pay for an expensive course of varying degrees, perhaps, or go to university. We don't have that much of that for production. Most of the game education industry, and as you mentioned, I have been in that as well, most of it's focused on design, development, and art. There's very little actually focused on production. The art is not only good for video games, but it could be for films. Like if you work at Pixar or something like that, it's animation, rendering, textures. Same thing for development, right? Even if you don't use it for video games, the knowledge of your programming skills can help you get a job in many different areas of programming. Game design is less broadly interpretable. I would say you can't really use much of a game design degree outside of the game design space, except in simulations, like military simulations, health simulations, and perhaps in other kinds of software where you can act as like a UX UI designer or something like that. But there really isn't much for game production. There is actually at Full Sail, there's a master's program that does teach a bit about, is actually mostly focused on game production. But such courses are kind of rare, and in my opinion, you should already really understand the game industry pretty well before you get into production. If you're going into production as your first gig, as someone who's maybe 22, 24 years old, with nothing but college experience, that may not be the best place to start.
So would you say that somebody joining the games industry, if they join as, say, they go through the QA path, which producers like, where they get into QA, work their asses off, and eventually manage to land a production gig, would you say that's actually quite useful because they get a bedding at least in how things work?
Yes. They've actually seen it in practice. There's other things you can get. There's Agile, Scrum certifications, and so forth. But again, these are focused on people who already know a bit about it, about those techniques. And the real problem, I think, is a systemic problem where it's hard to get an education once you're in the job industry, in the job market. You have a job. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to take a year or two off and go get a master's degree so I'll be better. But I'll come back. Your company's going to say, hey, you take a year or two off. Don't bother coming back. We'll have somebody hired, right?
Yeah.
So it's really hard to actually do that. It would have to be a kind of a program that is really intended for people to do as a part-time.
Well, I have an opinion, which I will now proffer. If you look at, say, becoming an accountant, God help you, and you look at somebody who's at school or college, and what happens is that people at a certain age, they're used to education. They grew up with education. They're used to having to work hard studying. They're used to having to face exams. They're used to having to get qualifications. Whichever country you're in, wherever you are, at a certain age, that's what you're doing pretty much more or less. And if you look at something like accountancy, you can go from your college degree or otherwise straight into a job in which you're not only doing work, but you're being paid for by the company to be heavily educated at quite an advanced pace, but you're also working. And of course, a lot of degrees are say 4 years, where 1 year is working somewhere. And I know that when I was at Sumo Digital, there were people there who were studying in universities, but were doing 1 year doing 1 year work experience at Sumo Digital. And I wonder if that could work rather well for producers, if there was actually a production course. The only one I know about in the UK, at Abate, there's a design and production. I looked up production part of that. It's one module out of 3 years is production. And even then, it's really about learning about processes and pipelines rather than actual production. So I think it's of interest to me that you would say that, but I think that you can educate somebody to go into production, but I don't think the education's there. So I think currently you can't. if that makes sense.
Right. You can if they already have the background, but it's very difficult to educate someone if they don't already have the background.
And of course, the education's not there right now. It just simply doesn't exist. I think because production's quite an anonymous, strange, amorphous gig that is difficult to describe and changes depending upon the company and the title. Doesn't help. And coming back to you, you've been a director of product vision at one point. What's that?
Well, it was kind of an amalgam of things, right? It was in that position I was managing both creative direction and production, and also working on establishing some research and development. So,
where was this?
So this was at Wargaming, and mainly in the Austin office. And so I had a team that was working on improving internal capabilities, right? Like in level design, for example. I was also directing game production, like for Master of Orion, and also overseeing the design of that project, as well as working with our marketing and publishing arms to deliver the project commercially, as well as gameplay. At the time, we really didn't have a single point of responsibility as we really should have over projects. They were not led by a single product director who had 100% financial ownership and authoritative ownership over the project. It was dispersed among multiple people. So that kind of segued to the creation of these project director positions, where the director had total control over their project, and they were able to integrate publishing, marketing, development, design, and everything together. But their main role was overseeing the coordination of all of these tasks, rather than a single portion of it, like not focusing on production or focusing on the marketing or focusing on the design, but making sure that all those things work together elegantly.
Okay, but that sounds more like an operations job than a creative direction job. How much of it was actually creative direction?
Quite a bit. You're actually very involved in game design in that role.
And I've talked to a couple of people, as you know. You're the third person that I'm interviewing here for this podcast, and each of them has said it's important for producers to own creative direction and creative vision to a degree when they're doing their jobs. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it really is a blend of product manager, project manager, and someone who can actually understand from the user perspective what makes it good.
When you say from the user perspective, I know some people will flinch and because they'll say you're not supposed to call people users. That's a very product owner thing to do. And that if you're a traditional console PC gamer, you'd never call people who play games users.
Well, I'm talking about software products in general. You use a product.
Okay.
So you're a user. For a game, yes, of course, that would be the player perspective. But I'm not only talking about, in fact, players. I am talking also about the people that you report to, right? You have to be able to understand the game's design, not only from playability and enjoyment, but also the monetary success. That's another aspect of it that isn't just a player perspective.
And I think it's interesting because talking to you, I find myself thinking, this conversation is very much aimed at executive producer level and above, isn't it, when it comes to the sort of things that we're talking about at the moment. And we've kind of leaped from where you were in 1998 or 2000 to being like a lead designer and a writer to now being a director of product vision in the current state that we're talking about, current role, I should say. How did you make that leap? How did that happen?
Well, actually, when I started at Wargaming in 2009, and we only had 65 people in a single office in Minsk, and I was the only non-native speaker of Russian. I was actually hired as a writer, as a game writer. I was the narrative designer for Order of War, which was a World War II real-time strategy game. And it was the first game that Wargaming developed in English and for a Western audience. Before that, all their games had been developed in Russian and primarily for the CIS countries. So the Commonwealth of Independent States, mainly Russia and Belarus. So
was that a good game?
It was good. The timeliness of it, unfortunately, there were a couple of other World War II real-time strategy games that came out right around the same time.
But you were the writer, you were doing narrative.
So I wrote all the audio scripts, all of the video scripts. I wrote all the interface blurbs and descriptions and storyline.
And then what happened?
That game was put onto the market. It was sold, and I also did some, because of my military background, I was able to give some military authenticity support as well. But then I was acting as a consultant because I was still in the U.S. The majority of the time and not in Minsk. But then the experimental World of Tanks game, I started helping out with that, but not greatly, until all of a sudden it turned out that it was very successful, primarily in Russia, and it was making some serious money. So Victor Kisley, the CEO, said, "Hey, come work for us full time," and so I did, as a senior producer.
As a senior producer, how much creative direction did you have?
I had quite a bit, but in wargaming, the production roles were a combination of creative direction and production, and they were handled by a separate group. That was the production group, and the production group took responsibility for all project direction and project management in the company. Well, even sometimes during post-development, but usually it was up until launch, and then the production group would move on to a different or several different tasks. It was not very efficient. Yeah.
Did they have dev directors partnered up with the senior?
Yes, the dev directors were mainly the project managers who would actually make sure that the day-to-day development got done and milestones were being met. More of a real producer role.
So off you went, and you were senior producer, and you climbed the ranks at Wargaming. And at the same time, you were pretty interested in VR, AR, and MR, weren't you? That was a big thing for you.
They're very cool. I always wanted it to be more than it has been able to be so far. Even today, it's still not quite there, mainly because the technology cost is still very high, both in terms of expert knowledge required to set up and configure and the actual monetary cost. Until it's in everybody's living room, it's going to be hard for profitability for games.
Are you still involved with like VR games and stuff like that? I mean, do you have a kit at home? Are you playing VR and whatever stuff each day?
I'm playing. I still haven't finished the Half-Life Alyx. It's an amazing game. And I've mentioned before, I like military games and shooters, so like Contractor VR and Pavlov VR, and I have the Walking Dead game that's in VR. There's just those kinds of games.
So you really do live and breathe games, and I know that I've said before you dress up as Stormtrooper and things like that. But if we look at your role around the game design Bachelor of Science course, what were you actually doing there? Because it sounded like you pretty much had to put the whole thing together yourself.
That's another place where I actually got in early to the group. I was the third person on the team. The team eventually comprised 30 or so course directors and department chairs. And I was the third person. I was originally hired to teach storytelling for games as a course.
So we're talking about your role when you were program manager at Full Sail University, right?
Yes. I was hired originally as the course director, as a teacher. And then as we went forward with bringing in students, and we grew and we had more people, we needed a department chair, and then we needed a program manager to manage the program. So I wound up filling those roles and hiring more people to teach those classes and be more department chairs until there were several department chairs under me.
So how do you decide what to put in a game design course?
Well, that program was actually about 3 years long, and it was done in a non-traditional way, online, with 30 days per class and a fixed sequence of classes. So there weren't any elective classes, and you couldn't take them out of sequence. So that way we knew exactly what the students had already been through.
Right.
And there was only one per month, so we could focus on one thing, and the students could focus on that one class. So we had first to build out what classes we wanted to teach, prioritize those, and then we had to put them in the sequence that would allow students to not get to level design 2 until they had level design 1. And then we had to, every year, go back and reevaluate what had happened so far and whether or not it was effective and should we make any changes. And so we did that.
Okay, but this is an online-only course, right? And they would presumably have coursework.
Yes, it was at
like
the time. Now it's online and on campus, but it's the same program.
Okay, and there were like 2,000 or so students
at a given time.
At the time. That's a lot of people, a lot of students, and you're charging them through game design one a month. But the modules, what you actually teach them, would you say that at Full Sail University, you had based that upon other design courses that were around, or did you do something particularly imaginative and different?
There, at the time, we were starting this, it was in 2009, also, that when I was also working at Wargaming. There weren't very many other schools that were doing anything like this. It was really, I would say, the big ones at the time were DigiPen in Washington State, USC in California, and SMU in Texas, which was a master's program. I think USC might have also been a master's program. Most people who were teaching anything were either focusing on art with a little bit of design thrown in, or programming with a little bit of design thrown in. And Full Sail did have a game development, and both game development and game art programs already, but they didn't have a design program. So we did take a bunch of things from the game art and game development programs, and plus, of course, the basic requirements, having maths and English and language and so forth, history and that. But we had to come up with what were all the core classes. What were the core things that a game designer should know? And how do we make them viable to be hired in the game industry? Not just, not just can I write a game design document, but can I do scripting in Unreal or in Unity? Can I write those game design documents? Can I build paper prototypes of games? Can I evaluate controllers and usability? Do I understand the difference between different types of games, how they're played, how they're designed? Do I understand the different pipelines and the roles of people who are in the industry? And, we had to balance all those things.
So it's interesting, right? So here we are 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years later. What sort of details do you think have changed in those 10 years? What would now be taught that wasn't being taught, and what would now have fallen the wayside because of how game development has changed in the last 10 years?
Mobile and VR have really impacted how games are developed and made and sold. And the technologies have had, I think, the most influence in the last 10 years. In addition, the competitive space in that area has grown dramatically. There are now many even community colleges that are offering, not full programs in game design, but they're offering some classes in game design. There are many schools that are offering game design degrees of various types, most of which are still focused on either art or development or a mixture of the two. But more in the last few years, there have been some more really good game design programs that have come out.
VR. What's the VR game development life cycle like? How much different is that from mobile or from PC console?
Well, it's not that much different. The technology is different, and how you actually build out the game and design the game, there are different aspects to it. But production-wise, like the SDLC, the simulation development life cycle in the case of the simulations that we're making, it is not that much different, right? You come up with an idea, you come up with a plan, you figure out how long it's going to take or how long you're going to work on it. You come up with your first couple of sprint ideas, and you jump in and you start coding and you start building out your environments and your characters and objects and so forth. Some of the key differences, of course, like in design, are that you're developing in a fully 3D space, which seems like you're already doing in a lot of 3D games on a computer, but you have to really take into account the fact that the person is physically present in that space and that they would be physically moving from one spot to another within that space. And also that like you have occlusion and level of detail things that you do, a lot of the tricks that you do to save memory in a regular game won't work in this because you're actually presenting to two monitors, one for each eye, and they're both offset for that kind of binocular range finding that helps you do your depth perception. And so you're actually showing a lot more, literally more than twice as much. It's more like 4 or 5 times as much. And because people can stick their face really close to it, like you can walk up, so in Alex, for example, in Half-Life Alex, you could go up to a radio and we look right up at the dial and then turn the knob and the dial moves. And you can't really do that in a PC game with a keyboard and a mouse. You're still at least a couple feet from your monitor, but you're always only about 1.5 inches from your monitor when you're in VR. So you can be really close to objects.
I can see that there's a lot of learnings that you can share with students so that they know these things when they enter that space. They come sort of, preloaded Matrix style, right? They come, and with mobile as well, they come already understanding that the pace is different in mobile. You can teach that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Which is very interesting and very useful. And surely you can do the same for game production. Surely you can explain and demonstrate how game production works around that and the areas of production and how they differ, and you can preload. But you're kind of saying, well, not really as your first gig. You need a more varied experience. You need to go in there and be a QA person or a designer or in art or whatever.
Going back to the analogy of the army, anybody can go through this basic training, right? You go through basic training, you go through an advanced school to learn your trade, and then you go off to the army and you're ready for doing the minimal amount of work, whether in this case, in the game industry, I would say, as an artist or as a programmer or a designer. But the producers are really like the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers of the game industry, right? They're the people who make sure that things happen, that things get done, and they get delivered. You have the executives, they're like the officers, right? They're doing all the paperwork. They're making sure that you get the funding and that you have the ability and the tools to do what you have to do. But it's the producers who have to kind of shoulder the burden of responsibility for making sure that things actually are delivered.
That's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to talk to some actual production recruiters, so some people who run game industry recruitment agencies, and we're going to talk about production recruitment. But when I look around at adverts for producers, even associate producers, you never see somebody go, hey, have you just graduated from university and you want to be a producer? Come and join us. You always see your experience, you must already have experience of, and they basically list an associate producer's role, as far as I'm concerned. And you need that before you can be an associate producer at this, at a certain company. So I think you're onto something there, and it's not something I've given a great deal of thought to, because I suppose I don't really agree with it. I can't find myself agreeing with that, because I figure somebody who's already in the games industry, say, a favourite example of a person who's working in QA and has been there for a few years and knows their way around gaming, they can step into an associate producer role. I mean, we know they can, because nearly everybody, it seems, who becomes a junior producer comes from that route. But I just wonder. I wonder if it's just a lack of education and a lack of real training that means we don't do the other route of saying, hey, you know what? You love games. You've done a course. Maybe you've done some work placement to reinforce your learning on a course. And now you're ready. You're ready to go in as a producer. I just wonder about that. I guess I find it extraordinary that we would say you can't be educated enough at say, a college to be a producer. But you would say, no, you need the experience, right? It's an NCO thing. You need that foundation knowledge, and you're not going to get taught that.
Yes. And I don't necessarily feel that experience has to be in the role. It can be in any role. But again, harkening back to the Army, once you've been a soldier for a year or two and you know how things actually work, and it's not just theory and training like it is in basic training, it's actual experience. Then you're really ready to lead. You've seen leaders in action. You've seen how things are done, and you've probably seen plenty of things go wrong and how they're handled, right? So part of the reason that I would say that you don't want to put someone in as a producer who has only had education in that area is that it's a very responsible position, and things do go wrong, and you don't want them to be sailing along comfortably and all of a sudden something goes wrong and they don't have a clue what to do, and they've never seen anything like it, and they don't know how to handle stress, because a production role is pretty stressful.
Sure. No, it's a good point. And I suppose if I look at my background, I have a very non-game industry background. I was working outside of the games industry for years, and I got a lot of leadership, project management type experience, which meant when I did come in, I was ready, because, and I think same as you, right? We, from our different backgrounds, we were ready to take on responsibility, and we were ready to go, yes, I'm happy to take on that responsibility. I'm happy to, make some mistakes and learn from them and get on with it and crack on and do a good job, because we had that confidence from other roles. So I absolutely see what you're saying. I'm still not sure I agree with you. But then again, I haven't given it enough thought, so I will. I'll talk to some other people about it as well. It's going to be a good question to pass around.
I don't think the reverse is any better, though. I don't think that taking people who have done a couple of years in design or art or QA and making them producers is also a great path. It's just the one that we're using right now. I would prefer that we took someone who had a couple of years of experience and also gave them an education in production.
I suppose I think back to your master's in game production that you mentioned a while back in this chat, and think to myself, surely if you're a producer, as part of your career, your company should back you doing education in your own time. And there should be places like that master's and other things where you can go, right, that's good. There's a foundation, there's a framework. I can at least go and learn what the hell project management is. And why has no one taught me how to make a really, really, really big 4-year long game, and how to schedule it all, and how to put it all together, and what are the common problems? What are the common issues? And if you stick in the same company for 5 years, you're only going to learn about what happens in that company. So that sharing of information and that community of knowledge is something I'm hoping we can maybe put together on this game production website and podcasts. And
absolutely. Before I went to Full Sail to teach, I actually got a master's degree in video game production and design from a different school. It was also online, and I had to work full time while I was doing it. And my expectation is that if you really have a person who's coming into production, you bring them in from whatever position they're at now, you make him an assistant producer, and you give them a year. You see how they do, if they're fitting in, if they're learning, and if they are, you say, hey, you know what? Here's a program. Take it. Get some education, get some training, and the company will pay for it. Why not? Give them a leg up.
Yeah, certainly I would have benefited from that, and we know each other's stories, but basically each of us is like self-educated when it comes to accreditation. And I think the best you can accomplish at the moment in production is the good old Scrum Master. Like, oh, I'm a Scrum Master. Oh, well done. And that's the end of your training for the next 10 years of your life or 20 years. You got a 1 month long training course in the Army every now and again. You'll be lucky to get 1 hour leadership training course across your whole career.
Sure. And what about tools training? I mean, how many producers get thrown into Jira or Excel or something that when they're first starting out that they haven't used before or they don't know very well? And these are some powerful tools that the expertise would be very valuable to them for their growth in their career. But nobody offers them training. They only just say, "Hey, here it is. You got a couple of days to read documentation. Get on it."
Or you have your Scrum Master associate producers getting all excited about Agile, and then 3 years later when they become a senior producer or whatever, they're told, oh, by the way, no, you have to use Gantt charts for the roadmap, and you have to understand how to use MS Project. Like, well, hang on. No, they're the enemy. No, you're going to have to use them because that's what we use up in exec world. And it's a tricky one. I think production in particular, you have to be extremely dedicated to self-education and self-learning. Can we do a deep dive into Master of Orion? Are we allowed?
It's fine with me.
So I was going to say, pick one game you've worked on and tell us what you were responsible for. I've just picked it for you, unless you want to pick a different one.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So what were you responsible for on Master
Just
of Orion?
about everything. Overall, design, development, production, delivery, any assets that were required for marketing, publishing.
So tell us a bit about Master of Orion. What was the deal there? How did it come about, and how many people were on it, and what sort of game was it?
So in 2013, so this was going back even further, actually. The IP of Master of Orion was one of the favorites of our CEO, Victor Kisley, who loved it when he was at Wargaming. So when he was a teenager, he played the heck out of this game. He liked that and Civilization, right? These so-called 4X games: expand, explore, exploit, and exterminate. And Atari was going out of business, and they kind of had a fire sale of getting rid of a bunch of IP. And so Victor went in and he bought Master of Orion. And so we owned it. We owned the IP. And having been a big fan of 4X games myself, I said, what are we going to do with it? And he said, well, we need to finally to re-release it to a new generation of players, but as a new game that's more fitting to the younger generation that exists now. And he had a studio in mind, but he wasn't sure if they were going to be able to do the scope of the project. So he told them they had 3 months to make a prototype, and he had me helped to manage their prototype. And it was amazing. It was much better than he had expected. So he greenlit the project. And the studio in Buenos Aires was NGD Studios, which is now known as Nimble Giant Entertainment. And they had about 50 people. And I had a team in Austin, again, as I was the director of product division. I had a team of a few level designers. I had a couple of artists and executive producer, UX, UI, so forth. So I had people who could do research and help out with all kinds of different parts of the program. The only budget I really had no control over was marketing and publishing. And this turned out to be a problem later on, but at first it was fine. So I basically oversaw the milestones, the planning, and coordinated all that with NGT Studios. And then anything that we were going to release with the game, we would do separately from NGT Studios. Now, what I maybe should not say is that originally Master of Orion was going to be a completely free game.
See, I wanted to ask you if I was allowed to ask you that.
and at this point, I don't care. I mean,
it's interesting, isn't it? Though it was Victor's love of the game. He wanted people to.
This is exactly what it was. And the original plan, which was, there were several of us who had a GDC one night with Victor, went over this, and everyone agreed that this is the best way to do it, including the CEO of NGD Studios and several of our key people. And the idea was to spend several millions of dollars of Victor's hard-earned money making this game and release it as a gift to the world.
Yep.
And it was a fantastic idea. It would have not only the benefits of everybody playing it, because who wouldn't play a free game of professional quality, no doubt, but also it would improve our level of respect in the community. It would be a bunch of things. In fact, Victor said perhaps maybe even do something like the Humble Bundle does and have it pay whatever you want for it, and use that money to help fund independent startup studios.
Wonderful, yeah.
As a nonprofit.
But it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. Unfortunately, we were well into production under this existing assumption when the ruble crashed in Russia, and 80% of our income, our revenue stream, was still Russia at the time. And so that was about beginning of 2015, I think. So
2 years into it.
Yeah, well, end of 2013, we got the prototype.
Oh, okay.
So it was like 1 year into it.
Okay.
Into full production. And someone in our publishing division convinced Victor that we should try to make a profit off of Master of Ryan to make up for the lost revenues from Russia. Not that they were that severe, but it was still money.
But that changes the design of a game a lot, doesn't it? Going from knowing it's going to be free to knowing it's not. Well,
it changed everything, right? Yeah, not only was it no longer free, we had to renegotiate all the contracts because they were on the basis of being a free game and profit sharing and so forth. Then we had to include marketing and publishing. We had to have things that were like pre-order bonuses. We had to have DLC content available later. We had to have promo items done.
Sure, we had to have like a long tail concept and all that.
And instead of just putting it on our platform for free, which would entice people to come to the wargaming platform and then see our other games, the core trilogy as we call them, World of Tanks, World of Warplanes, and World of Warships. Instead, we had to put it onto platforms where people go to play games, like Steam. We also had to put it on good old games because they were popular in Eastern Europe, partly because they had no DLC restrictions. Not DLC restrictions. They didn't have any
But did you fight that one?
Restrictions.
Did you fight that?
I tried to, but I had no say over what publishing decided. And this turned out to be a problem later. And then eventually when we did have project directors who owned the entire product from start to finish, including marketing, they were able to make better control over that. But I could not at that time.
Okay.
We did some awesome stuff, like we did some great voiceovers and stuff, but we were already doing those anyway, even with the free game.
You had some celebrities involved, right?
Oh, yeah. It was great. I got to actually fly out to Warner Brothers Studios in Hollywood and direct people like, Luke Skywalker, right? Mark Hamill.
Yeah.
Alan Tudyk, and there were so many. They were really fantastic voice actors and very, very great quality in our production staff there was excellent.
It's one of the exciting bits about being a producer, isn't it? That you get to do things like that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Let me ask you. I know you could go on for a while, and I'm not going to stop you because I want to ask you some pointed questions. So, you maybe have answered this one. Did you feel vital to the overall effort of making the game? Did you ever feel like a spare part?
I never felt like a spare part. My head was on the chopping block for every decision, and so I had to be neck deep in the game design and production and assets delivery, making sure that we had an offsite perforce backup, daily, all that. I had to do all the stakeholder management with Victor and everyone else. It was very challenging and a lot of effort, and there were a lot of changes going on all the time. Partly because of this halfway through development decision to make it a paying game, which at the time, we had no idea whether it would even make a profit.
So what was the biggest change, or the biggest, say, top 3 changes that you had to make when that happened?
Well, we had to split off some of the content for DLC.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to develop, the platform deliveries, I would say, was probably the biggest thing. We had to then negotiate with Steam and determine how that was going to work. But also, we had to do a lot more localizations so they could be on multiple delivery systems in different countries. Also, the decision was made to go into Steam Greenlight. So the idea originally was that we go into Greenlight for 3 months and then launch. But 3 months is not long enough to make any changes. So if you're doing a 3-month Greenlight, you're basically saying, we're actually done. We're not listening to our audience. And we're really going to release what we have, and it's in final testing. Yeah. So if you are going to have a true Greenlight with actual testing, and the gathering of feedback from the audience and building that into the game, you need at least 6 months. And we didn't even realize that until a month or two in, where it was like, okay, we only have, we're about to go gold master, and we still have a long backlog of things that we want to put in. So we extended out the green light for a few more months, and then for 2 more months after that until we actually launched.
So let me ask you, did people understand that decision meant that the scope of the game had to be scaled back?
It's not that it had to be scaled back even. We had already had a quite extensive scope to begin with. The main problem was that we were no longer, we were building the same game, basically, right? That we were building from the beginning, same idea, which was we have a game that feels like Master of Orion and Master of Orion 2, but is AAA quality, the kind of graphical level of quality and the voiceover quality that people expect from AAA games today, but is more approachable, has a lot more AI guidance for new players who have never played 4X games. So that way, the generation that is used to playing free games and dumping out of them, or mobile games where they're very easy to understand and they're scaffolded very well, will be able to get into it. The games, the original Master of Orion, Master of Orion 2, while they were super successful in the very hardcore game community of that time, which is a very nerdy, and I myself obviously was part of that.
800-page manual.
Hacker mentality of gamer. Didn't care that we were playing a game that was driven by spreadsheets, in which we would actually develop offline spreadsheets for. We didn't want that to be the case for this game. We wanted players to be able to understand the game from within the game. And so there was a lot of hand-holding, a lot more simplicity to it. We even had, because our office was in Austin, and the original Master of Orion was made in Austin, we were actually able to get a few of the people who had worked on the original games to help us out and give us their feedback and help guide us through what they would have done if they had the kind of budgets and resources and technology that we had. So the game was supposed to actually, even according to them, be an improvement over the originals.
What sort of things did they want in that you were able to put in? Oh,
like the star lanes, real-time combat, which this is the dichotomy, right? There's, I always, obviously, as you mentioned, I'm a Star Wars nerd. I always gave the analog to Star Wars 7. So when Star Wars 7 came out, they're like 10% of the people who watched it hated it. Oh, they said, this is absolutely nothing like the Star Wars that I really, remember from my youth. It was either just a ripoff of it or whatever. And then 10% of the people said, wow, this is the best Star Wars movie ever. This is fantastic. And then the 80% in between just watched it and liked it. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the goal that we had was, okay, yeah, the 10% of the hardcore fans might say that this isn't really a spreadsheet game and it's too simple. And the 10% on the other end may just say, wow, this is like the best 4X game ever. But we expected 80% of the people would actually enjoy it and play it, which was fine because we were giving the game away for free.
Yeah.
Once we had to actually take into account what players wanted, because we were trying to sell the game, there was only really one community, and that was the hardcore players. And they wanted a lot of changes back toward the game, and that made perfect sense for them. But they were not the audience that we were originally striving for, and we made some changes, but not enough.
And you didn't have time if you only had a few months in alpha, right?
We had we had probably about eight months or so that we could actually make more of these changes at the end, but it was not enough. And
that's quite tragic, isn't it?
It was. It still wound up being a great game, and there's still a lot of people playing it. I'm actually still, don't tell Victor, but I'm still actually listed as an admin in the Steam forums for the game, right? So so I see everything that pops up. Every time there's a new post, I see it. And I don't go in there and edit stuff or make any changes, but I'm just happy to see that the community is still alive and that people are working on it. And there's modders who do it. Like one of the core features we wanted to have at the beginning was that because it was free, right? Modders could mod and do whatever they wanted with it. And we kept that in right through the end, and modders are still adding to the game. But yeah, to me, it was successful as a game, and it would have been a fantastic success as a free game where people just couldn't really complain about it, right? It's free. But financially, because of decisions made in the publishing side, the massive expenses of marketing, and then on top of which the game's core audience was only growing smaller and smaller, and more vociferous, it was not the financial success we had hoped for toward the end.
It's really interesting. It's not even a cautionary tale. It's reasonably normal in the games industry, isn't it, for this sort of thing to be happening?
And that's exactly the kind of thing that people should be prepared for, both as producers, and as players, right? That things are going to change, things are going to happen.
Yeah. I remember. Well, it doesn't matter what I remember, but certainly you have to be resilient as a producer. But I asked you some questions earlier about, well, did you fight it, and whatever, and I knew what you were going to say, which is, well, you put a logical argument together, but talk us through it, because I'd like, as a person, as a member of the senior team making decisions, I'd like to know, how far did you push it, and what advice would you give to people who would be tempted to get quite passionate?
I would say save your energy for the important fights, and the person who's in charge is whoever controls the budget. So since the production and development that I was in charge of had its own budget, but publishing and marketing had their own budget. So they didn't care what I thought. They were going to get paid the same, no matter whether I said yes or no to something, because they were going to decide ultimately whether or not a certain video got posted or, an advertisement was done a certain way.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a good answer. How much of your job was project management, and what form did it take?
Because it was a third-party studio that we were working with, a lot of the production was handled mainly in-house, and it was I was notified of what was going on, and I had full access to all of the sprint charts and reports and the velocity, and I was involved in stand-ups and things like that. But it was not. I wasn't very hands-on with it. I did have an executive producer in Austin who was very daily working with the head of production there in Buenos Aires.
Right. I was just going to say it's like being an external producer, right? Pretty much.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And so how did you plan in that situation?
I mean, we did sprints, but we also had milestones that we had to hit. Mm-hmm. And so the milestones were, I want to say, major milestone about every 6 months.
And the major milestones, did that involve the Nimble Giant studio having to deliver to, say, your EP and you, or was it more you were more involved in that beforehand? You needed it to be delivered to your leadership team.
Yeah, I needed to deliver it to leadership team. So I was getting the sprint builds every sprint. So that was, and I was giving feedback every cycle, and
So you were like the customer, and they were delivering to you, and
yeah. But I would fly down there and spend weeks down there. So did my executive producer. And we were in constant contact, mainly through Skype.
If I look at decision making about what you think about a demo that's being or shown to you, or the state of the game that's being shown to you, there's a lot of people in the Agile community will say, well, you should be looking at data-driven decisions. You should be looking at what you know the end customer actually wants by looking at the data, by looking at the actual, the mathematical reality of the situation. When you were flying down and doing your assessments, I'm presuming that wasn't the case. So how did you make your decisions?
We're not making widgets, or as our previous head of global development had told me once, actually, when he was on Cyprus for his job interview, he said, we're not making shampoo. It's not something that we can make and say, this is exactly what we're going to make. We're going to change this here and this there and then make it. It's as much art as it is science. Mm-hmm. And so we had to not only establish our design pillars and our goals and stick to them, but we also had to understand, is this elegant? Are these systems working together? Is this fun? This is much more like making a movie than it is like, than writing the script, I would say, right? It's more about feel. And that's, if you're coming from like a product management role in another industry, to be a producer in the game industry, you have to understand that. Because if you're coming from a industrial sector or even another software sector where you're more interested in interface and numerical output, this is going to catch you off guard.
It's very interesting, though, isn't it? The analogy with movies, and of course, the original use of the term producer came from the movies and was then transformed into something wildly inaccurate, really, for gaming. But if we stick with movies, of course, you make a film, you don't really know if people are going to come in their droves, unless it's a Marvel thing. But you're going to show it to an audience beforehand, before you go live. You're going to show it to an audience, or in a number of theaters, let's say, and you're going to get some feedback, and then you're going to decide in the editing room what to do about it, to use old-fashioned terminology. But it's amazing how we're still doing that with games, isn't it? It's and it takes me back to what you said about art. It's part art. Do you think that is a process that you have seen improved over the years, or do you think it's something that will always be that way? It's simply some games which should have been hits just aren't going to be. They come out at the wrong time, just like movies.
We've seen both ends of the spectrum and everything in between, not only in the history of games, but even just every year, right? And again, relating back to movies, look how many of our successes, just like movies, are just repeats of the same old game. Look at the Call of Duty franchise, right? Or Halo, or any of these other ones that go on and on, just because they are guaranteed money. It's just like you were saying about the Marvel movies, right? You know it's going to be a success because you have a dedicated fan base. So you make the next Call of Duty, you make the next Medal of Honor or Battlefield. They're all recycling the same kind of concepts because they're still popular. So why not? And we see a lot of games that do that, and a lot of movies that do that. We also see a lot of kind of art house movies and art house games, right? We see the ones that get the film awards at the film festivals don't make much money. Yeah. They get all these great awards and stuff, but they aren't fantastically popular movies. And the same can be said of a lot of games, right? There's some games that are just incredibly beautiful and elegant, but maybe they only offer 2 or 3 hours of gameplay, and they just aren't sticking to the majority of the population. But we've also seen the far other end, where, like, look at Zynga, right? Machine Zone, these data-driven mobile games, where all they're looking for is what pushes up the number by 0.1%.
Yep.
Toward our revenue. And if it does, we don't care what it is, we're going to do it. And we're just going to keep doing it until we make as much money as we can.
It's mathematics, not fun. Yeah.
And those games aren't, in general, to me, fun, but people play them because they're for the same reason they play roulette or slot machines, right? They think, that they have a chance to beat the system, or that it'll get better somehow.
Mm. It's very interesting. And do you see that improving for... When I say improving, let me rephrase that. Do you think there's a way of mixing and matching some of the insights? Because I know that if I look at my experience of trying to get marketing research off companies to help us make a game, where you say, well, okay, so tell me about gamers at the moment. So how what type of gamers are there? And okay, the explorer type, etc. And it seems like it ground to a halt a little while ago, and nothing new really came out of any research. And I'm wondering, how much of that sort of research do you think should be done and is useful, and how much of it is just going to be gut feeling and pure luck?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the stuff I've seen passed off as research I could have found through a search engine in an hour. On the other hand, a lot of it is also very specific. Like at Wargaming, we actually did an annual survey of our players and asked them, for example, like, why do they play, or what other kinds of games do they play? And because of the very large numbers of players that we had, even if only a very small number of them proportionally responded, I think we got 19 or 20,000 responses back a year. And that's very much enough for a good, cross-section.
Sure.
And we found out, for example, that the Russian players play it for much different reasons than American players. That their play styles are different. That the games that they play, though, the other games that they play, besides like World of Tanks, were similar. That they focus on military games, first-person shooters, action games, and tactical games. We assumed originally that World of Tanks was going to skew much older. And in fact, it did, but not nearly as old as we thought. Like, we expected the average player to be in their 30s. And it turned out, I think it was about 26, which put it, a good 5 years or more over most games.
A lot of them were serving in the military, right?
Yeah, but, not that many. There were definitely people in the military who were playing. In fact, I was just reading an article today about some U.S. Army tanker units that, because everybody's stuck at home from the pandemic, they're actually playing a lot of games like World of Tanks together online,
right?
To practice their skills. I guess that's something to be said for that. But there's the number of military players isn't necessarily that high, and the number of hardcore historical authenticity players that we expected was also not nearly as high as the people who just play it for fun. In fact, at one point we released a game mode that was historical mode, and we thought it was going to get those gaming hardcore grognards that love to play, or grognards, I guess I didn't pronounce that, how to play this very historically accurate mode where you're limited in types of ammunition, types of vehicles. You're actually not playing capture the flag like you do in World of Tanks, but you're playing only with accurate kind of World War II sides for realistic battles. And nobody played it. We had so few people playing it that it would take like 10 minutes to get into a match.
Wow, that really is nobody playing it.
And I tried playing it several times because I'm really interested in that stuff. And because of the long match length and the fact that people would just quit during the match if they didn't get the vehicle that they wanted, it was much less fun than it could have been.
But do you think that sort of mistake, which it obviously was, do you think that sort of mistake could have been fixed if you'd done a bit more market research?
Part of the problem, I think, was the market research.
Okay.
If you do market research in a usability lab that is inside the company and everyone knows that company and loves their product, you get a bias right away when you start doing it. That mode should have been play tested among gamers who weren't interested in World of Tanks, but were interested in, or maybe mildly interested in World of Tanks, but not necessarily people who already loved it, because people who love it, as I said earlier, depending on where you're from, for different reasons.
I guess you've probably had the same experience that I have, where you work in a place and the first thing that happens when you're making a new game is you invite the other people in the company to play your game and you get feedback from them. And that's a terrible form of bias too, isn't it? Because then right. The people who have actually got the balls to say, oh dear, that's a bit rubbish, isn't it? Become the outliers who don't get as much, don't get listened to as much unless a lead designer happens to agree with them, in which case they hook onto that and use it. But right. I just think it's really interesting, the tension between making a large scale, say, AAA game where you're trying to keep it a secret, what you're doing, or a little bit of a secret anyway. You're kind of showing it to the people that work around you. You have to be quite limited getting it in front of other gamers and getting their feedback. And you compare all of that. And you're doing that for maybe 3 years. You compare that to mobile, in which there's that real product ownership sort of value vision, get it in front of the customer as soon as possible thing. And as soon as there's something to show, you're getting reams of people to have a go at it. And I wonder if there's going to be a crossover soon, if that's going to change. What do you think?
I think that has to do with the platform. Absolutely. Because, so for example, you take, you launch the game early, but you launch it in Singapore or whatever, someplace that
yep.
isn't a global market.
A controllable region.
Yes. Yeah. And you can only do that because Apple and Android have very controlled delivery systems. It's just like something like Xbox and PlayStation, except that Xbox and PlayStation don't do that. They just don't, have a regional launch. So it's much easier on mobile to be able to test with a partial product. Another thing you can do on mobile that you can't really do with like a PC game very easily is to launch under a fake name with a fake publisher. This way, nobody gets any bias from the company. They don't get any bias from, you can test out your game title that way. You can test out a bunch of different things, but you can yank it when it doesn't make any money and you don't care, because you're just going to learn from that and build. When you launch something on PC, everybody knows and it goes everywhere at the same time, and you don't have that much control over what gets said anywhere.
Just to finish off on Master of Orion, if you could have gone back and done one thing differently, what would it have been?
Give the game away. I would have pushed back to Victor harder, like adamantly, that this had to be a free game, and made a lot more effort to make sure that happened, because that would have made all the difference. And if that didn't work, I would have said I had to be in charge of the publishing and marketing budget, because that wound up being at least as high as our development budget, which is not uncommon in games. But given that we were already going to be tight to make a profit on our development costs, it was an unreasonably high expense. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, because when I asked for advice earlier that you would give others, you kind of said, well, I mean, to paraphrase, fight the right battles, right? But you're saying actually that's a battle you would have gone back. Why didn't you then? Were you just...
I didn't realize the impact it was going to have.
Hindsight then. That's why. Yeah. The gaming industry is interesting because it can cover PC, console, mobile games, but it can also cover, of course, online gambling games. It can cover simulations and especially now with VR, etc. So, in fact, do you consider yourself still in the games industry with what you're doing?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we're using Unity. We're using HTC Vive Pros. We're using the same exact kind of development lifecycle and hardware as a game application. We're just, the purpose of our product is different.
Sure, and I think, see, that's a great question to ask you, because I haven't really had the opportunity to ask this yet, but to other people. But when you enter the games industry, I think some people spend their whole lives in it and assume there's nothing outside that could appeal to them. And of course, if you're a coder, you can go off and work in a bank and be very bored but rich. In your case, you've kind of popped in and out a little bit here of the traditional games industry. But do you think that that's a path for producers? Do you think there's a way that producers can be advised on the kind of jobs out there that they might not know about?
Sure. Like I would say simulations are very close in technology and kind of delivery methodology to games. But because they're responsible to a government contract and the government wants to see milestones, the government's the customer, right? In fact, they're not the user in this case. It's another reason I think I probably used user earlier. The government's not the user. They're the customer. The user is actually a soldier somewhere who isn't going to see this at all until it's in their hands as a finished product. They're going to have no input at all for most of the time about whether it's actually useful or not. The contract types of life cycles, the delays in contracting, sometimes contracts take a year to come through. Like a small game studio couldn't survive that long on zero budget. The level of creativity is very restrictive, and there are all sorts of other things that you have to do, like security compliance, and if it's something that can't be distributed overseas, or if it's classified, or there are many other factors to take into account when you're creating a simulation that aren't relevant to a game. A simulation lies somewhere between the game industry production lifecycle and, let's say, traditional software, productivity or banking software, something like that.
Yeah. Because you're an executive producer there. So what's a day in the life for you there that's, say, different from what it would have been on, say, Master of Orion?
Because it's a small studio, I'm doing a lot of things that I wouldn't have done, like, let's say, at Wargaming as a project director, or at Bohemia Interactive, even as a studio director, because I'm handling things like logistics and compliance and interfacing with Unity reps, and also doing QA testing and R&D into hardware, because we have our own custom weapons hardware for use in this. And I'm also writing up process documents, kind of like you remember when we stood up Wargaming Mobile and we wrote this all the operational documents and the software development lifecycle and so forth. Yeah, so all those kinds of things. So I'm not just in the backlog every day, although I'm doing all of the the sprint reports and backlog refinement and daily stand-ups.
But there's a level of program management there with compliance and security and privacy and that sort of stuff. Yeah, cool. So what would you like to see improved in the world of game production and the games industry?
I definitely would agree with you that the education of a producer is not doesn't have a really solid foundation at this point. It is either you learn as you go and educate yourself on your own by reading books, or you have an education in it, but you don't really have any experience of how the industry actually works, just theory, which I suppose could be said of any job that you take after a master's degree or a PhD, and you really think you know everything, but you only know what you read in books. So I would say the practicum portion of the education is kind of not matching the theoretical portion. Either you have one or the other, but combining the two is difficult to find. And having an educational program, maybe something similar to Udemy or Khan Academy or something like that, that would allow producers to self-educate, and maybe even with a plan of progressing courses, and maybe even with some kind of certification, would be of value to those producers who are either missing one thing or the other, right? They're either missing the practical experience or they're missing the theoretical education.
If you do not train a producer how to do project management and they simply learn by being in the job for some years and then they're put in charge of a very large game, eventually that could lead to crunch. And I think a lot of the crunch culture, although it's from the top downwards to a degree, right, where people say, oh, we've agreed to deliver this, you're just going to have to do it, kill all your people. Some of it surely is in the hands of producers. Some of surely is they don't know really how to plan a game that's enormous because they were never taught how to.
You're far too kind. I would have said that all of it is the responsibility of the producer. Crunch comes from poor planning. Either poor planning on the part of the producer or not going to their hire and saying, we cannot deliver that. Your timelines are not reasonable. It will not happen.
But you said earlier, there's only so far you can push, right? When you're a producer. So some of it, unless it's with hindsight, some of it you simply can't push back on. You just have to try and do your best, right?
Crunch is one of those things that I think you should always push back on. And I don't care why you've said that you're going to deliver this game on this date, because you didn't, I mean, the producer can also say, hey, yeah, we're going to do crunch and it's my fault. Maybe the producer totally messed things up and got their calculations wrong and that was it, right? In that case, yes, then they can definitely say, hey, this is my fault, we're going to do crunch. But if it's coming down from higher where somebody says, hey, we have to do it because our delivery date is this date and we can't pay people after that date, you may still have to do it anyway, right? I'm not saying that you're not going to do it. If you say you're not going to do it, sometimes you have to. But I think as a producer, it's your responsibility to point out when this is a problem of over-promising and under-delivering instead of doing the right thing, which is under-promising and over-delivering. If you're trying to cut your margins too thin to get a contract or to deliver a product at the lowest cost, you're not focusing where you should be focusing, which is on your customer, on your player, and on a quality product.
It's interesting though, because if you were to take money out of the equation, when you read a lot of news reports about, especially in the last 5-10 years, so many games now are huge and are routinely delayed a year or two. And I always look at those reports and think, I wonder what's going through the producer's head. Not just one producer, but all the producers on that, from exec or whatever downwards. What's going through their heads when they're saying, okay, we're going to be a year late, okay? And because they must have known that for quite a long time. And what's the conversation like? So what are they talking about? Well, how are they discussing it? And now I've been in that situation, and to me, the most important discussion was, how are we going to rescope this? Which parts of the pillars of features, etc., can we strip back? How are we going to sort of produce the least we can to come out with the game on time? And I guess it's quite bold, isn't it, to be able to say we're delaying for a year because you presume that what you're getting is a higher quality product, a higher quality game, right?
Yeah, nobody on the consumer end cares if you deliver on time at all. They only care if you have a good product. The day after it's delivered is the same as a year after it's delivered. It exists and it's out there. So it doesn't really matter to them. The only place it matters is on your side, right? On the development side, because your game now goes from a $100 million game to a $120 million game. And so you better deliver, another $100 million of profit on top of that. And that's where the problem is. And sometimes the problem is that the design doesn't resonate. Sometimes you have to rethink and overhaul a lot of stuff. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you have technical issues, although those should be the least of your worries. But maybe you have, for example, like too much the server doesn't work well, and you can't get you have a lot of lag and a lot of jumping around, or something like that. Crashes and so forth, and those are things that you should definitely fix, right? Maybe you do have a lot of bugs, a lot of issues to fix. But if you release a game into the wild that's on time, but it's buggy and laggy and broken, people are only going to remember that it's buggy and laggy and broken. They're not going to care that it's on time. So it's always better to delay, except for the cost.
Do you think it's relatively simple to make a large game? Do you think it should be relatively simple for producers to be able to put together a plan and say, right, okay, so if we do this stuff here and we make this many assets and we follow these pipelines and we find the fun by this time and then we hit production and we convey about the shit out of everything and shove it all together, it shouldn't be that hard to make. Do you think that?
That would be nice. There's just so many games in so many genres. Games are of so many sizes and so many variations in quality that it's really hard to say this game is going to be this quality and this cost and this time and require these exact assets up front. I mean, that's the old waterfall method, and we know that doesn't work well. It's guesswork. And I don't think that works for movies, if you go back to that analogy, any better than it does for games.
Well, except movies, you tend to have, for most movies, not all, but you tend to have a script and a general idea of what you're doing. And whereas with games, you start off with something that might be, say, design documents that may be enormous and may not be, depends on how waterfall the approach is, right? But you need to get out there and do the whole finding the fun. Whereas with a movie, you can follow your script and get on with it, right? So you've got a much clearer idea. Do you not agree with that?
Except that you've got to build all those sets in advance. You got to figure out what your budget's going to be, because you got to figure out what actors you can afford to hire. All that stuff has to happen before you start filming. It's not just the script at that point. It's like having a design document. Like you may remember the last and really awesome, fun project that I was working on at Wargaming, which is still not announced or happening. So I won't mention it. But but to mention it, we very quickly were able to come up with a prototype and find the fun. And I had like a 300-page design document to back that up. So here's where we're going. Here's what we have. Here's where the fun is. Here's where we're going to go forward with it. That's really enough to move forward on. And then from there, you build a prototype, you build a vertical slice, you build the rest of the game out, you build content out. It's like if you build if you're building a game like like Call of Duty, right? You don't say, we're going to build these 100 soldiers. You build 10 of them. And then you build the rest when those 10 have proven that they can do the right thing, that they work and they function. They're all different classes and so forth. It's not like a movie where you're filming the whole thing, and that's it. You don't film the movie in a warehouse with a bunch of non-actors and film the entire movie and then show it to audiences and say, okay, just imagine that there's a scene and they're good actors and there's a good set.
I think you've just described a vertical slice, haven't you?
Yeah, you do it with games though, but you can't do that with movies. I mean, that's kind of one of the places where the analogy falls apart, I guess.
No, but it's an interesting discussion, but one we don't have time for. Let's finish off. So, what's next for you?
More of this. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I've got, I'll retire at some point, but it won't be for at least probably another half a dozen years or more. And in the meantime, I like making things. This is not only fun, but it feels like the simulation space feels valuable to me. Right? I'm not here just entertaining people or just making money. I'm helping. It feels more like the things that I miss about the Army when I retired in 2012 is that I felt like I was doing something purposeful that was of value to the community and helping others. And this kind of has both the kind of attention to detail and the I guess the similar processes to making a game, but also has the other advantage of, it's more useful. It's more of a tool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my dad would agree with you. He every time I get out of the game industry, he congratulates me heartily on my new moral integrity versus every time I get back in. So I think he'd be very pleased with what you're doing. Not so pleased with me. So is there a farewell message that I can leave at the end of my podcast? I like doing that.
You like doing that? Farewell to who?
A farewell.
Farewell
to arms, yeah.
Great minds think alike. I would just say that everybody has their own path. You don't have to, go into QA. You don't have to go straight into the game industry from college. You don't have to know somebody in the industry. Networking is great. Going to conferences is great. Reading all you can, studying, learning, going to school, those are all valuable. But all kinds of real life experience that you have is applicable to all other kinds of experience that you have in some way. And I have found that whether it's my military experience, whether it's my study of languages, whether it's my education, or whether it's my experience in writing like technical documentation or financial software, everything applies somewhere. And so whatever experience you have, make it your unique thing and leverage it so that you can be successful and happy.
Thanks for listening. As always, we really appreciate your thoughts and feedback about the show. You can reach out to us by visiting game-production.com's podcast pages and leaving comments under each episode. We have a Facebook group and YouTube channel that you can find linked from the website. If you want to contribute or fancy a chat in the future, we'd love to hear from you.